They've really failed to bring the budget back in line.
It's quite simple. You need to cut spending.
France is in a state of emergency.
There is clearly a problem with French public finances.
They built one of the most generous welfare systems in the world. If you lose your job or you want to retire, there's a strong safety net. This model was built in a time when there were 4 workers for every 1 retiree. That's now closer to 2. And by 2050, it will likely go down to just 1. Similarly, of every 50 people in 1970, only 1 was unemployed. Today, that figure is 4 times higher. Fewer people contribute to the system and more people depend on it. People stopped having kids and the population became older. Not just that, a person is now expected to live 10 years longer than in 1970, which is amazing. But it also adds 10 years of pension costs that the state and the workers have to cough up. Everything put together results in that France is no longer able to afford its generous public spending, and instead of making reforms, they historically just borrowed more money.
France's debt has reached a record.
Every year since 1970, they have spent more than they earned. In some years, adding well over 100 billion euros to France's public debt.
This is the 10th day of nationwide demonstrations.
But each time that the government is trying to make a change, the public explodes.
Throwing projectiles and smashing windows.
This is France's spending problem, with hindsight. So if you're not from France and you mostly listen to international media, you likely have the wrong idea.
But the second you tell them they have to work, they do this.
Weeks of protests from lazy French people. I'm 71 and I'm working.
The French need structural reform, and they cannot continue like this. But each attempt to change the system has resulted in massive public unrest.
They're angry over the government's new labour reforms.
It began as a protest about fuel tax rises.
But there's a reason why the opposition can mobilize millions of people. In exactly 1 year from now, Macron is going to retire as the French president, and that gives him one last chance to get France's finances under control. Our story begins after World War II. France had to be rebuilt. Not just its cities that were left in ruins, but also economically and socially. The leaders of the late 1940s had a bold vision: sécurité sociale, or social security. The French economy was growing fast, often with over 5% of economic growth per year in the 1950s and 60s. And the population at this time was young and working. They rebuilt France with a system where the state guarantees healthcare, good pensions, and unemployment and family benefits for all citizens. By 1970, they had one of the most generous welfare systems in the world, and that's when the party ended. The oil shocks of the 1970s shattered a dream, and this set France on a different path. Unemployment suddenly jumped from 2% in the mid-1970s to 9% by the late 1980s, creating a larger pool of people who were not contributing to the system, but they were depending on it. It was the start of a deep structural shift. Economic growth slowed, people had less money to spend, and families started having fewer kids. This all contributed to an aging population, but no politician dared to confront the deeper structural problems. Before the 1970s, the French government sometimes spent more and sometimes spent less than it earned. But after these oil shocks, they ran their first serious budget deficits, which came down to several billion euros per year. This could have been, in hindsight, a wake-up call, but instead, over the next decades, they only increased their deficit, adding tens and sometimes hundreds of billions of euros in debt every year. The model didn't structurally change. It promised the same level of protection, but the underlying economy could no longer support it. In the 1990s came the first serious reform attempts.
Millions took to the streets to protest welfare reforms put forward by the government.
The response was immediate. Weeks of nationwide strikes brought the transport systems to a halt, and the government was forced to retreat. The same pattern repeated in the early 2000s. Again in the 2010s. And later in the 2020s. Reform is now no longer just difficult, it is politically explosive. The French currently find themselves in a deadlock, and they must get their finances under control. And we've seen in 2010 with Greece what could happen if they don't. The Greek economy accounts for just 2% of the total EU GDP, but their debt crisis cascaded across the continent, but France is good for 17% of the entire EU economy. This could seriously escalate and the French have to do something. But if reform is so necessary, why do so many French voice opposition? So it might seem obvious that the French system needs to be reformed, but millions of people are against such reforms, and if you care to listen to their perspective, they might have a point, and I'm gonna get to that. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Hindsight is a small business, and if you have your own, you know that managing a business can be quite time-consuming and frustrating. You must stay compliant. You don't want to spend too much time. And a particular frustration of mine is that for every single thing that you need to do, there's a different app. But that is where Odoo found a solution. They are an all-in-one management software. They offer more than 45 apps that help you manage your business. You can use it to sign documents, to send invoices, or to keep track of timesheets. If you would get separate subscriptions for each of these platforms, the costs really add up. But with Odoo, you can select the apps that you need, and you have your entire business administration in one place. And because all of these apps, they communicate with each other, your info will always stay updated, which helps you avoid making mistakes. And because everything is updated and adjusted to your country, it also helps you stay compliant. Try Odoo today by using my link in the pinned comment or description, and you'll get one app for free with unlimited support and hosting. And starting at just €19.90 per month, you'll gain access to all available applications. Try it today. France is the second largest economy in the EU, but year after year, they are spending more than they earn. This built up massive public debt, and as long as investors have confidence in the government's ability to stabilize its finances, this doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. So France wants to play in the same league as Germany, and for many years, investors saw it the same way. They considered an investment in France just as safe as an investment in Germany, and you can see this by looking at the credit ratings. So a credit score is basically a score that is given by certain companies or agencies about how risky an investment is in a certain country. And that's where in recent years the picture has changed.
France's sovereign credit score is at its lowest level on record. In its report, Fitch paints a grim picture of the state of France's public finances.
France's credit ratings was lowered several times since the early 2010s and now sits at a historically low level. Rising debt, weak economic growth, and a government consistently spending more than it earns lowered investors' confidence. To make matters worse, after years of dropping interest rates, the European Central Bank has now started to increase the rates once more. For France, a country with an unusually large public debt, this is extremely costly. Over the billions of euros that it has borrowed over the years, it needs to pay interest. High interest rates equal high costs. This adds strain to France's government budget, but reform is extremely difficult.
La France s'est démocratiquement exprimée.
The rupture began in 2005.
Officials began counting the results of a vote which has bitterly divided France and transfixed Europe.
That year, French voters were asked to approve a new EU constitution that was backed by nearly the entire political elite. The public voted against it. The constitution was later abandoned, but many of its key elements returned through a new treaty. This one was passed without another referendum in France, and for many voters this felt like a betrayal. This was seen as proof that major decisions were now made above their heads in a system that no longer listened to them.
The government is simply not listening to the French people.
In 2016, President Hollande pushed through a sweeping labor reform.
74% of national opinion is against this law.
Loosening hiring and firing rules to boost the economy.
Determined to revolt against the government's labor reforms, in Paris, protests occurred for the 8th time since the plans were announced.
But the public backlash was immediate. Protests erupted across the country, and instead of backing down, the government forced the law through parliament without a full vote.
The strikes and closures of the past few days shifting to violence.
In the next couple of years, unemployment went down with a few percentage points, but workers saw that the job market had changed. It had become harder to find a stable contract, and employers could now more easily fire their employees. This all contributed to a lasting impression that the people had of the government when they proposed a reform. they asked the people to take a risk, but this often resulted in an immediate loss, while the benefits were delayed and uncertain.
It started off as a protest against rising taxes on petrol and diesel.
The government increased taxes on fuel.
But now these protesters are saying every aspect of their lives is a struggle.
Police are moving in on the yellow vest protesters who've been throwing missiles.
This was framed as a climate measure, and for many people, especially in the countryside, the extra cost for fuel landed immediately. For many of them, driving wasn't optional. They had to drive to go to work. The benefits of paying more for fuel felt distant and unclear, while the cost was immediate and painful. This sparked the Yellow Vest protests. At its peak, hundreds of thousands of people were protesting nationwide. But what made this moment different was who showed up. It wasn't just union members or activists, but this time the movement was joined by middle-class workers, retirees, and small business owners. A government attempt to reform wasn't interpreted as a shared effort for the future, but as an unfair burden placed on those that were already struggling. By the 2020s, the dynamic had fully flipped.
Vous avez la parole pour conclure.
Alors, pour que ça soit clair pour tout le monde, c'est que nous sommes en train de préparer une grande réforme de notre système de retraite pour le rendre plus juste, plus transparent. Mais le futur système, il ne touche aucun des retraités actuels, aucune des personnes qui sont à 5 à 10 ans même de la retraite.
Macron, in 2023, proposed to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, and people flipped out.
Young protesters with their rocks and bottles disappearing in clouds of tear gas.
Over 1 million people took to the streets repeatedly. So for the government, it comes down to a simple math problem. By 2020, there were only 2 workers left for every 1 retiree. At current demographic trends, there will only be 1 worker for every 1 pensioner by 2050. The French welfare system is incredibly generous, and to be a little bit more precise, an average person who is retired earns 98% of what an average worker does. And the French government saw a simple solution. To cut public spending, people had to work a little bit longer, so there were more people contributing for longer and fewer people that were dependent on the system. But their math may be wrong. The problem isn't pensions, the problem is public spending. The French government spends more than half of all the money that its economy generates each year. No country in the developed world spends so much money relative to its GDP, but that's not because of pensions. Little over a third of spending goes to social protection, and this is the part that includes pensions. That is a relatively high percentage to pay for social welfare, but increasing the retirement age isn't a silver bullet. The French government pays a steep price for pensions. They're really expensive. To be precise, they spend roughly 15% of their entire GDP each year to fund this system. That's high and above average, but not much higher than the US or Germany, who both spend around 13%. But the French could retire at 62. That is much earlier than the US or Germany. This system was paid for in large part by the workers themselves. Over 28% of a worker's income goes to funding this system. In almost no country do workers pay so much to save up for their golden years. And that's what the government was proposing to change.
Mais qu'est-ce que c'est le déficit? Ça veut dire de fait que vous choisissez de faire payer vos enfants parce qu'aujourd'hui vous refusez de décider et plus on va attendre, plus il se dégradera. Donc cette réforme, elle est nécessaire.
It is true that France must reform, and it's a decision to do this by reforming pensions. But in 2010, this was already done. The retirement age was then raised from 60 to 62. And today, a decade and a half later, some estimates say that it didn't cut government spending at all, while other estimates say that it actually increased government spending as it added to higher unemployment benefits. So it was the same pattern all over again. The government first proposes a reform. The loss that people have to take was immediate, while the benefits were far away in the future and they were uncertain at best. People voiced a widespread opposition to these plans of the government, but regardless, it was forced through.
On ne peut pas faire de paris sur l'avenir de nos retraites. Cette réforme est nécessaire.
So I'm not here to push an agenda. I don't want to tell you that pensions should stay the same as they are or that they should be reformed. The point that I'm trying to make is that this is a choice that ideally the French people should make with wide popular support. French politicians have often forced reforms through despite widespread opposition from the people, and this has eroded trust. Now, France is struggling to keep its finances under control, and guess what? People are now skeptical of whatever politicians propose, and this shouldn't come as a surprise. What I see is that this topic is often discussed through a very populist lens where everybody in the government is a bad actor, or it is treated through this very narrow economic lens where it's reduced to a simple math problem. But in my opinion, it is neither. It is a fact that reform is necessary, but reform comes at a price. The core of France's gridlock is that they cannot agree of how the burden of reform is going to be distributed. Each time that a reform is proposed, the country erupts. But each proposed reform seems to lay the burden on the same people. These proposals hit society in different ways. Young, lower to middle income workers often enter the workforce earlier. They often work more physically demanding jobs, and they have more working years before they reach retirement age, as opposed to higher income earners, who often spend more time studying. The problem is that the reforms that the French government is proposing seems to always lay the burden on those people that already have the fewest options, and the benefits for them, personally, are unclear and far away. I can see on a long-term average that only 10% of you watching my videos are actually subscribed to my channel. Get my videos suggested more often and help me grow this channel by subscribing now. And if you want to see another video, here are 2 more that you can consider for your next watch.